Michael Cantor, our highly respected United States trade representative, has gained a reputation for his resolute style, which is why the rest of the world knows him as a tough and effective negotiator when American trade interests are at stake. We who work with him know him as Mickey. Born in Nashville, Tennessee, Ambassador Cantor was a partner in the law firm Manat, Phelps & Phillips from 1975 until 1993, and is also a veteran of the rough and tumble world of political campaigning, acting most recently as national chair for the Clinton-Gore 92 campaign. He has a long history of public service, recently serving on the Christopher Commission, which was formed in the aftermath of the Rodney King beating in Los Angeles. During the Carter administration, Ambassador Cantor was on the board of the Legal Services Corporation and has been a board member of the Center for Law in the Public Interest. Mickey Cantor's style has brought new energy to the office of the United States Trade Representative, and his effectiveness has made him a star of the Clinton administration. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Mickey Cantor.
Thank you, Joan. You didn't have to stop. You could have kept going. I listened with interest to my career as a private lawyer. My first client in private practice is in this audience, and he's still standing, so at least I've accomplished something. B. Rappaport is here. He called me on my first day that I joined my former law firm and became a client, but more than that, he became a wonderful friend and a great friend of my family, and it's wonderful to see him here, as well as seeing our Ambassador Designate Larry Lawrence and many of my friends from California who are here today. I would like to talk to you about the third great challenge we face in this century, and that is the challenge of the post-Cold War world, and the challenge and the place that trade plays in that challenge that we face. First, let me just quickly review what the first two challenges were. The first after the First World War in the early 1930s, when met with the challenge of opening our markets or closing them, met with the challenge of whether or not we were going to truly expand trade and try to grow jobs in this country, we did the opposite. The Congress of the United States closed our markets. Our imports went down by 1/3, but of course our exports went down by 1/3. We lost even more jobs and of course threw the whole world into a depression. That was the ill-fated Smoot-Hawley law. The second great challenge was after the Second World War, and we met that challenge. And many of you and many of your parents and my parents met that challenge with GATT and with Bretton Woods and with NATO and with the United Nations. And we opened our markets and allowed our allies in Europe and in Asia, especially Japan, to protect their infant industries, have access to our markets, to be strong bulwarks against Soviet expansionism. And it worked, and it worked well, and it's been good for the world. Now, as we have been successful, and as the Soviet Empire has broken up into Russia and the Confederation of Independent States, as Eastern Europe now is trying to discover market economies, as the world now looks to this post-Cold War era, we're faced with a third great challenge. And as the President said on February 26 at American University, the challenge is, are we going to compete or are we going to retreat? This administration intends to compete. We intend to compete in three different ways. One, we recognize our economic security has truly become our national security. Secretary of State said it very well in his, in fact, better than anyone in his confirmation hearings. No longer would our foreign policy and our security interests drive our economic interests. Our economic interests have now become paramount, and they begin right here at home. Hold down the deficit, keep long-term interest rates low, create private capital for private business, which after all is the engine of growth in this society. Make sure we invest in our people again, which we haven't for so many years. Education needs to be reformed. Welfare needs to be reformed. The President already has already has a package of items up in the Congress, and which will more be developed later on reemployment in order to invest in our people. National service is now becoming a reality in this country. Those are the things we need to do in order to strengthen our economy, to make sure we can compete in a global marketplace. Truly, in the 1980s, many of you know our businesses were not ready, but due to becoming lean and mean, due to new technology and more capital investments, we can compete with anyone. And so as we learn to compete, as we become the most productive workers in the world, which we are today, the challenge is, where are our new markets? Because truly, as you become more productive, if your markets don't increase, obviously you lose jobs. And that's what's been happening in our manufacturing sector. The third part of this, of course, is no more status quo. We have got to change our friend. The globalization of our economy and of the economies of the world is not going to stop because we're afraid to face fear. What we need to do is face the facts. And the fact is, as we become more productive, as we become more of a competitor, as we're able to look to other markets around the world, we have got to open them up with new trade agreements, bilaterally, regionally, multilaterally. Bilaterally, if you must, and we'll talk about Japan a little later, and we'll talk about China and the challenges they present, and the ASEAN nations, which are growing so fast, and Asia, which I think Secretary Christopher talked to you about earlier this morning. 40% of our trade is in Asia today. 40% of our trade. It is growing exponentially. And we need to meet that challenge as we meet the challenge with NAFTA in our own hemisphere. So what I'd like to review with you today is what this administration is trying to do in three different ways. One, build credibility for a trade policy, connect our domestic economic program with our foreign economic program, and work on all three levels, bilaterally, regionally, and multilaterally. First, what does it mean to build credibility? For too many years, we have not satisfied the American people, Democrats or Republicans, were willing to enforce our trade laws and our trade agreements. No more in this administration. That's not a matter of being tough. It's not just a matter of being realistic. It's not just a matter of advocating for you as you try to work in foreign markets. It's understanding a truth. If the American people don't believe we'll stand up for them, if they don't believe we'll fairly enforce our trade laws and our trade agreements, then truly any policy we implement, whether it's NAFTA, the Uruguay round, we're developing a trade and investment framework around the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, the Japanese framework, trying to open up markets in China, working with the ASEAN nations, none of it is politically possible until we build credibility here at home, and we mean to do it. Whether it means opening the heavy electrical equipment market in Europe, which had been closed since the Marshall Plan, literally since the Marshall Plan, whether it means making sure our intellectual property rights are protected around the world, or whether it means making sure we have side agreements on the NAFTA that ensure that Mexico and Canada and the United States, excuse me, all three nations enforce their environmental and labor laws in order that no company, as a result of failure to enforce, has a competitive advantage or disadvantage, then truly we cannot have a credible trade policy. Now, we need to connect our domestic and economic programs, which we're doing today. The President has made it very clear, as we become more productive, we need to open markets, and that brings us to 3 or 4 major issues. We're facing today a vote on November 17th in the House of Representatives on the North American Free Trade Agreement and the side agreements. What is this fight all about? What the fight is all about is one side, those who oppose NAFTA, look at the future through a rear-view mirror. They're literally thinking the past is the future. The second thing they believe is Americans can't compete. They don't believe we can open a market for all of you and your workers, and that you can, with fair rules, can compete and win. Well, the President of the United States doesn't believe that. He believes we can win again. He believes that American workers and American businesses can compete with anyone as long as the rules are fair. So what does NAFTA do? It does some very simple things. One, builds the largest free trade zone in the world. Makes us more competitive, more productive, builds more capital, builds more jobs. Very simple. Second simple thing, it takes unfair rules that Mexico has had regarding the United States for years and years and years and makes them fair. It doesn't tilt them in our favor, nor in Canada's favor. It makes them fair. Lowers tariff barriers eventually to zero on agricultural and manufactured products. Right now, Mexico's tariffs are about 2.5 times larger than ours. It lowers the non-tariff or rules, non-tariff barriers or rules, gets rid of them that in fact locked our products out of that market. Many of you probably have experienced these rules. If you're in the automobile industry, they had something called the Mexican Auto Decree. Literally, because of performance and production standards and because of trade balancing requirements, there was no way you could export a car from the United States into Mexico. We exported last year 1,000 cars from this market into Mexico. While we were building, we were getting a 5% increased market share of our own domestic auto market because of being more productive, and literally beating the Japanese for the first time in years. We could not get into the Mexican market, the fastest growing auto market in the world. That changes under NAFTA. The unfair rules go. The tariffs are cut in half immediately. And what happens? We'll sell 60,000 cars next year alone. Our trade with Mexico in autos and auto parts and trucks and buses will go up $2 billion. And folks, all of you know what that means. That means jobs. That means jobs for American workers. The next thing we do is get rid of the Maquiladora program. Now, we understand what that was. We adopted that program in 1965 when we were the preeminent economic power in the world, when we could open our markets and allow a situation where others did not open their markets. But that has to stop. What the Maquiladora program was, move your company to northern Mexico, import component parts for free, send them back to the United States basically tariff-free, and have a competitive advantage over companies who stayed here. Not very smart, to say the least. If you stop and think about it, why in the world would you stay here if you could have high tariff barriers to protect you, unfair rules to protect you, you brought your component parts in for free, and you shipped them back in to the world's largest market? No wonder there are 2,000 companies now in the Maquiladora region. That will stop after NAFTA because all the preferences go. This is not rocket science. I'm telling you, it makes such good sense to do this. And the last thing we're going to do is, through these side agreements, the Mexican government, for the first time, has agreed to both fines and trade sanctions if, in fact, they don't enforce their environmental or labor laws. What does that do? Raise their costs of doing business, make sure that their workers are treated fairly, and makes our companies more competitive. Now, there are all kinds of studies floating out there, 24, most studied trade agreement in world history. You could go blind reading all these studies. 23 of the 24 says we'll win, we'll have a net employment increase. But let's look at the real world. I just came from a products fair at the White House where the president spoke. I talked to 9 different companies. Joan, you'll be interested. 9 companies, all manufacturing. I asked them 2 questions. What will happen to your trade with Mexico when the tariffs go down to zero? We'll get a bigger share of a growing market. Middle class is growing quickly. We'll compete very well down there. And I said, what will happen with regard to your biggest competitor? They said, we'll win because they will have the high tariffs and we won't. And I asked all 9, who is your biggest competitor? And they said, the Japanese. All 9. And they range everywhere from specialty steel to automobiles, you name it, they were all there. Now, if you want to do something about a $50 billion trade deficit with Japan, if we want to be more competitive with the European community, open up this hemisphere for U.S. goods and services. And I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll not only have trade preferences, we'll grow the world's largest free trade zone, but it will help grow the global economy, and that's our commitment. If the United States does not take the leadership in growing the global economy, we're going to continue to have what we have in Europe today and Japan: no growth, high unemployment, at least in Europe, and growing unemployment in Japan, which is almost unheard, I guess it is unheard of since the Second World War. That is not good for us. So this is a policy that hangs together: open our hemisphere, spur global growth, others' economies to grow, buy more of our exports, continue to grow more and more jobs here in the United States. $6 trillion to the world economy, almost. I didn't say it quite met it. $6 trillion. $1.2 trillion of that will be the United States. $1,700 a year will be added to the median income of every family in the United States per year for 10 years if we have a successful Uruguay round. That means we got to open up goods and lower the tariffs for manufactured goods. We got to go to tariffication in agriculture. We have to open the service sectors. We're in the middle of those discussions now. You've probably read we're having some interesting talks with the French. Again, the French have said that it's not quite to their liking. If you want to have an interesting evening, you should have been with me when I spent 3 hours on Thursday night in Brussels with the French trade minister. We should have televised it. It was an interesting discussion. The Uruguay round has enormous economic impact on us, but it's connected to NAFTA. If, in fact, we're growing our markets in this hemisphere and we lower tariff barriers around the world, we are geometrically increasing jobs and the kind of income and capital we can produce in this country. And it helps every one of you, whether you're global or not, do a better job, not only in terms of your profits, but in terms of raising wages, which, of course, is critical to this administration. As we do these things, NAFTA and the Uruguay round, we have got to look west. We have got to look west to Asia. 40% of our trade is there. We need to use the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum to begin to build trade and investment frameworks in the Pacific. Obviously, we have problems with many countries in that region in terms of protecting intellectual property, protecting investment, opening their markets. One of the key problems we have today, of course, is dealing with Japan. During the G7 talks in July in Japan, we reached an agreement with the President's leadership for framework talks with the Japanese. For the first time, they agreed to discuss a results-oriented trade policy. Now, for all of you who do business with Japan, I don't know how many in this room, raise your hand, how many do business with Japan? I'm almost afraid to ask this question, but I bet you I could get a large majority, if not every one of you, to say we should forget about a rules-based negotiation and go to results-oriented, because that's what the Japanese understand, and that's how we react to opening their markets. Out of the exports, Japan exported to the United States in 1992 about $98 billion, it's $97 billion to be correct, $97 billion worth of product. 60% were in six areas. Autos and auto parts, semiconductors and computers, and there are two others I can't remember for the moment. All high-tech items, and if you look at those markets in Japan, for those six, they're closed to us. They're closed to us. Although we have 40% of the computer market privately in Japan, guess what we sell to the central government in terms of computers in Japan? 0.4%. They have locked us out of that market. We have to open it up, and the only way to do so is to have mutual targets that we can reach, that are understood, and that are concrete. By just asking the Japanese to change the way they organize their society or change their rules will not work. We've tried that. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We've got to stop it. And right now we're in the middle of these talks on autos, on telecommunications, on insurance. We'll take up 4 other sectors in the second half or in the first half of 1994. We expect to be successful in these negotiations. But obviously it's also connected to the Uruguay round. If we can open up the Japanese in terms of tariff barriers and services in the round, it makes it easier to open up in terms of the framework talks. The last thing I want to mention today, and I probably have gone on too long, but you can tell it's a subject that obviously interests me greatly, is what we're doing with China. We have a almost $20 billion trade deficit with China. It's the second largest trade deficit we have in the world, and it's growing every day. We have a memorandum of understanding to open up Chinese markets for our goods. It is not being adhered to. We have understanding on quotas for textiles and apparels that the Chinese are circumventing, taking advantage of us. We have got to have a new relationship with China which respects our laws, our rules, our agreements with them, as well as opening up their market to us in order for the Chinese economy to grow, but also we can't sustain a growing deficit with China either politically or economically. Let me finish by saying it's all of you that are the key not only to this administration's success, but more importantly to the country's success. You are the people who have built the businesses, hired the workers, and competed internationally. What we mean to do is be your partner. We want to reach trade agreements that open up markets for you. We want to enforce the law when you're being taken advantage of. We want to enforce trade agreements which make those agreements more productive for you. But what we want to do most is work with you to build American wages, build American jobs, and build America's future. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer. Yes, sir. Or try to answer.
Sam Barbershop, La Quinta Motor Inn, Texas. As you know, Texas has a very big stake in NAFTA.
$18 billion worth of exports last year to Mexico.
Plus more to come, hopefully. Give us your evaluation of the political implications in Mexico and in Central and South America if NAFTA fails.
I didn't talk about that because, as the President has said many times, we don't want to lead with the negative, and we shouldn't. But the implications, of course, are quite serious. As all of you, there are many of you here from border states, and you understand exactly what it means. Let me give you one. We're getting great cooperation now out of the Salinas administration on immigration and drugs. Let me approach that from two different points of view. That cooperation will be difficult to continue if NAFTA goes down, because the confidence we have built with the Mexican administration and future Mexican administrations, frankly, will be demolished by the U.S. rejecting this agreement. That is because they're about to go into an election campaign in Mexico, as you're well aware. You know what the issue is going to be if NAFTA is rejected. Who can be the most anti-American? Who can bash the United States the most for turning down this trade agreement? Who can take advantage of the disappointment, not only in Mexico, but all the way to Argentina? Let me say something about that region. 400 million people south of the Rio Grande, the second fastest growing region economically in the world. By proximity and by proclivity, they should be our biggest markets. We have trade surpluses with nearly every nation south of the Rio Grande, 5.4 billion with Mexico alone. While we have trade deficits in Asia, and we pay so much attention to Asia, and we have right now running a deficit with Europe, here we have trade surpluses with our own neighbors, and we'll be unwilling to enter into this agreement. So number one, it hurts immigration by not stemming the flow. It stops cooperation, and I think it will hurt our ability to stop drugs coming in over the border. That's number one. The second problem that we have is, for years, starting with Roosevelt, we have told Latin America, be our partner, be our friend. Stick with us politically and in terms of our security interests. Build your democracies and build your market economies, and we'll be there. For much of this time, it has not been anything more than empty rhetoric. We finally have a chance to do something concrete, not only for us, because it is in our interest, but for Latin America. Can you imagine the disappointment? Can you imagine the disappointment if we reject this treaty? And number three, not only does nature abhor a vacuum, so does trade. I can tell you the second largest investor in Mexico is, it's the Japanese. I can tell you who's investing in South America right now, it's the Europeans. If we do not take advantage of these markets, you don't have to be a genius to figure out who is going to. So in all three ways, if we reject this, we'll be losers in Latin America, and we'll pay a very heavy price for many, many years. I thank you for your question. Yes, sir. Was that a question or just a wave?
No, this is a repeat question that was punted your way by Laura Tyson. Will the United States support the Dunkel draft text on anti-dumping, which is a simplification of the complex dumping codes on a multilateral basis?
I thank Laura for punting that. She put it up in the air 50 yards and I had to call for a fair catch. Now let's see if I'm going to fumble or not. The answer is no. We will not support the current language in the Dunkel text. We need changes, and we'll get changes in that language. It's not acceptable now because it unfairly and unduly weakens not only our dumping laws, but dumping laws in Europe, and they're necessary in terms of to protect our industries in unfair situations. There are a number of them that have occurred just during our administration, one of them involving some involving aluminum, involving steel, and we mean to enforce those laws. We don't want to weaken the anti-dumping law. We're not asking to make it stronger. We just don't want it weakened by the Uruguay round. Yes, sir.
With respect to the Japanese construction industry, and the inability of American firms, really, by virtue of the methodology by which they do business, what is our resolve with regard to the November 1st potential sanctions that might be imposed, A, and B, your comment was interesting with respect to their changing of their business practices versus results-oriented, and I'd like to get a comment on that with respect to the construction industry. I'm Ralph DeCibio from the Parsons Corporation.
Hey, Ralph, how are you? The Japanese government procurement and construction, architectural engineering services is literally closed to U.S. purveyors, as you know quite well. Closed. I don't mean slightly open, I mean closed. It's closed to all foreign purveyors, not just the United States. We have attempted over the past few months to negotiate in good faith to open up that market, which is an important one, and frankly the Japanese refuse to do so. They still have a procedure where they literally pick the bidders on a project before the bids ever come in, and you're not even allowed to bid. Their rules are not transparent, as you know so well. We want to change those rules, which are hurting our companies, and not only our companies, we're doing this on an MFN basis. We're trying to open it up for everyone. If, in fact, by November 1st, we have not reached agreement on opening up that sector, we're going to take action on Title VII, which is under our government procurement regulations, in order to take sanctions against the Japanese, invoke sanctions, to make sure they open that market one way or the other. It's the only way we believe the Japanese seriously will address this issue. Now, we would be delighted if over the next 10 days, 2 weeks, the Japanese came in and said we're willing to change these rules and to make them fair and to allow not only your companies, but companies around the world to compete in this very large market. But we have seen no sign of that thus far. Yes, sir.
Agriculture being in the agreement?
No.
Good answer.
I was hoping. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ambassador. I'm David Seal, president of AMC Entertainment International. As you know, entertainment is now the second largest cash export earner of the United States, and is also the industry against which more trade barriers are set on a global basis than any other of our major export industries. As you know, the situation in Japan is a very difficult one. There are countries like Indonesia where, for example, no company that is not 100% Indonesian owned and has 100% Indonesian employees may be involved in the distribution or exhibition of motion pictures. It's a very large opportunity for American industry to improve our balance of payments, our balance of trade. What approach do you foresee? Because of the cultural sensitivities and the xenophobia, we would hope a very reasoned and patient diplomatic effort would be undertaken, but we feel, all of us in this industry, that some action needs to be taken.
Number one, we agree and we understand just how important your industry is to this country and our trade balance. It is one of the big winners that we have. It's one of the products that we have, entertainment, that is almost unique to this country. It's interesting as you go around the world. American television programs, movies, music dominates the world scene. As a result, we're facing more and more pressures and more unfair laws that are trying to lock our products out under the title of cultural specificity or cultural carve-outs. We face that in Europe today, as you know, with the broadcast directive. Doesn't directly affect your exhibition business, but affects, in fact, those products which you exhibit. And of course we face it in Asia and other places. Obviously we're trying to work on 3 levels. 1, protect intellectual property and pirating. That's important. 2, open up markets for you and others in the entertainment industry where there have been unfair rules and laws passed which keep us out and don't give us national treatment, full national treatment. And 3rd, of course, to make sure there are no unfair laws under the title of cultural specificity, which literally mean our products can't get into our market and their industries are protected because our products are so good and their people want to see them, hear them, watch them. We're working on that in the Uruguay round. As you know, the French had taken at least somewhat of a public position, which they have now backed off of, I'm happy to say. They would not put audio-visual, or would not want audio-visual in the Uruguay round. The Uruguay round is a first step to broadly protect the rights of U.S. Movie exhibition companies, movie companies, music companies, television production companies to purvey their products around the world. After that, I think we're going to have to work on both a regional and bilateral basis to not only protect the product, but to open the markets for people such as yourself. One more. Thank you, Joan. Yes, sir.
Maybe this is a good concluding question. Gordon Johnson from Johnson Associates. My question, you made an eloquent address supporting NAFTA. I'd like to ask this group here, how many people, I think you're speaking to the choir, how many here are in favor of NAFTA? I mean, do we have, that seems to be a substantial majority. I know you can't use this room for lobbying purposes or things like that, but
I would never do such a thing.
If every person in this room can generate 100 letters through their employees, through their suppliers, through their network of associates, clients, even their lawyers, would this be helpful if those letters go to the Congress, or should they go to the newspapers, and how much time do we have to do this?
Even I can hit this fastball. Let me just say this. All of you have tremendous reach. Everyone in this room. You have prestige. You are very important in your communities, in your states, and in the nation. You are CEOs and major executives of large companies. Your advocacy, without telling you what to do, because I can't, your advocacy of the NAFTA in the next 3.5 weeks is critical. I wish you could have heard the President today. You were here. Maybe you'll see it on television tonight. The most eloquent and passionate, not only defense of, but resolute manner in favor of NAFTA I have heard. The President is working his heart out for this agreement because he knows it's in the best interest of this country. This President would never do anything to cost jobs in this country, and the American people know it. But we need your help. We need your advocacy. We can't do it alone. Each of you and those who work for you in advocating the NAFTA in any way you see fit, which you think would be effective and make a difference, would be tremendously helpful in the next 3.5 weeks. We are going to win this, but we can win it only with your support. I appreciate your obviously candid and thoughtful and correct observations, and I appreciate all of you and what you can do over the next few weeks. Winning the NAFTA makes us more powerful in the Uruguay round and probably makes that more likely than not going to happen, and then makes us potentially much more successful in dealing with our bilateral and regional problems in Asia. I really appreciate your having me today. I appreciate your being so patient and listening to me, and I look forward to working with each and every one of you over the next few months. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you all can see why not only is Mickey a great representative, but from a personal perspective, he's a lot of fun to work with. Thank you.
See you later.
We're going to move briskly right along to our next speaker, and I will say also on a personal note, we've had 3 Californians, and at last I'm joined by a New Yorker. It's been said that Ken Brody loves the challenge. We are very fortunate that he has accepted the challenge of serving as president and chair of the Export-Import Bank of the United States. During his 20 years with Goldman Sachs investment banking firm, Ken Brody served as co-head of the Merchant Banking Group, head of the Real Estate Group, and founder and head of the High Technology Group. Along with his broad investment banking experience, Mr. Brody has also extensive international financial experience and was a founding partner of Petrus Partners and a private investment firm. Ken Brody holds an MBA from the Harvard Business School and is a self-taught classics scholar. But his goals are far from the ivory towers of academe. He has said, and I'm quoting, "I view our mission simply to make Ex-Im Bank the most efficient and effective tool it can be for creating and preserving U.S. jobs and increasing the sale of American goods and services abroad." Please welcome Ken Brody.
Good morning. It's a privilege to be part of such a distinguished group. In particular, I wish to thank our host, Secretary of State Christopher, for including me. I'm confident that by the end of this day, you will conclude that this administration is committed to meeting the challenges that global change presents. Above all, we are a results-driven group, one that understands your need for performance, not any interest in rhetoric. Each administration has as its goal peace and prosperity. Easier said than done. I risk a prediction that we will soon see a return of strong economic growth. I believe that the 1990s will be the decade of American exports, and that the next century will be one of American prosperity built upon our ability to compete successfully in the global marketplace. How can I be so sanguine when the papers remain full of warnings about layoffs and stagnant wages? How can I, as one who has worked 20 years in investment banking, make optimistic forecasts when the economic signs are so mixed? How can I, as a former businessman who understands your need for stability and predictability, be so bold when we are spending so much time talking about all the changes in the world before us? Let me share an historical analogy that will show that even in this time of global change, there is a road towards stability and predictability, towards profits and prosperity. Think back to just after World War II, the last time there was such global change on a monumental scale. Economists, businessmen, workers simply assumed that with the stimulus of war production gone, the U.S. would return to something close to the dark days of the Depression. The United States was going through an unprecedented military drawdown as millions of servicemen and wartime workers scrambled to find jobs. Japan and Europe were in tatters, both economically and physically. Communism had emerged as a world force. The headlines blared with global crises in Berlin, Greece, China. There was wide criticism at that time of the administration for its failure to develop a coherent foreign policy. Today, in the post-Cold War period, we again face the challenge of rapid change. A defense drawdown is again triggering concern about the economy's future. Europe and Japan are in economic slumps. Economists predict that the record unemployment levels in the OECD countries will go even higher. The fall of the Iron Curtain, like its rise, has created a whole set of new uncertainties. The critics have taken voice again. We all know the outcome after the post-World War II era, despite all the fears, it was the beginning of the longest sustained economic boom in U.S. history. Fortunately, demographics, smart government, and productive American business combined to spur American prosperity beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The baby boom sparked a huge expansion of the U.S. internal market. Government used defense savings to reduce the deficit. It created the Marshall Plan, helped establish the UN, the World Bank, the IMF. It created a U.S. education infrastructure through the GI Bill. Lower interest rates and government programs fueled a housing boom, and American business productivity, honed by the war, was high. The Clinton administration has set a course in the post-Cold War era that points in the same direction. The deficit reduction package has contributed to sharply lower interest rates. Long-term rates are at a 20-year low. This is perhaps the most telling sign of stability and predictability. We are extending assistance to Russia to ensure its continued evolution towards democracy and a free market economy. As Mickey Cantor so forcefully stated, we are fighting to implement NAFTA and GATT. President Clinton is committed to revitalizing our education system through the National Service Bill, the Lifetime Job Training Initiative, and elementary and secondary school reform. A second plank of the Prosperity Platform is also in place. American productivity, honed this time by the realities of global competition, is again high. Finally, and the subject I shall spend a little more time on today, is we are blessed with fortunate demographics. This time we don't have the ballooning domestic demand we had back then, but we have an even larger market for U.S. goods and services in the developing world, especially in Asia. There is one major difference between 1947 and now. After World War II, the United States was the sole player. Now, the pickings are not quite so easy. We must be even smarter and more aggressive. Government and business must work together. You often come to us for support. This administration is committed to give it to you. But we must have your support too. When President Clinton commits to a national export strategy, as he did 3 weeks ago, you must avail yourself of its opportunities. When Mickey Cantor opens a market, you need to act quickly to drive a truck through the opening. Let's trace the path I see us taking together into the 21st century. First, I'll describe some of the demographic and economic trends that point to the growth markets. Then I'll briefly describe what the Clinton administration is doing to help business tap these markets. Then finally, I'll discuss a bit about what Ex-Im Bank can do to help you create U.S. jobs through exports. The developed world will continue, obviously, to be a tremendously important market for all of us. And already dynamic, developing economies like Mexico will become bigger markets. But the largest long-term growth in demand for American exports will come from countries with enormous populations whose private sectors are just beginning to take off. The developing world's GDP today accounts for nearly half of the world's output. Once these countries get their free market systems rolling, they are going to be economic powerhouses. The real action in the next 10, 20, 30 plus years will be in the developing world. Already the trends are clear. The developed world's annual GDP growth the past decade was 3%, projected in the next decade to be a little bit lower. By contrast, the developing world's growth was a shade under 3% in the past 10 years and is predicted to be a shade under 5% in the next 10 years. And Asia's growth has been and is expected to continue at 6.5% per year. 4 of the 6 most populous countries in the world are developing countries. China, with 1.1 billion people. India, close to 900 million people. Indonesia, 190 million people. Brazil, close to 150 million people. A 5th, Russia, has a population of close to 150 million as well. The potential for growth is staggering. China right now is probably has the 2nd highest gross national product in the world. Many economists predict that in 10 to 15 years, it will be the largest economy. We need to take the long view in building a commercial presence in these markets. Otherwise, our foreign competitors will eat our lunch. Certainly, we have lots of room for export growth. Our foreign sales of goods and services approximate 11% of our GDP. This compares with 38% for Germany. And even though our exports have grown enormously since 1970, when they were 5.5% of our GDP, our major competitors' exports have grown faster. As I mentioned, all of the administration's major initiatives are aimed at strengthening U.S. global competitiveness into the next century. Cutting the budget deficit, containing health care costs, education and job training initiatives, promoting free trade through NAFTA and GATT. These drives will make us more competitive. President Clinton understands the demographics of the developing world. He is committed to economic growth through exports. 3 weeks ago, he announced his national export strategy, a specific set of 65 recommendations, virtually all of which are in process of being put into place. And virtually everyone here today who is speaking has been part of that effort. In putting together this strategy, Secretary Ron Brown led a comprehensive look at how government can do an effective job of helping business substantially increase U.S. exports. Under the Secretary's guidance and probing, an interagency team produced real results on time. We're determined to develop a coordinated, targeted, and aggressive strategy to significantly increase exports and strengthen our leadership in the years to come. And in our financially constrained society, this plan does not require any new funds. What it does require is strategy, organization, performance, a recognition of what industry really needs and what government can realistically accomplish. As Secretary Christopher detailed, we will be providing U.S. government advocacy at the highest levels on behalf of American companies pursuing foreign government procurement opportunities. Our competitors have done this for decades. Now it is our turn to do unto them as they have done unto us. As the President announced 3 weeks ago, we will combat tied aid practices of our competitors. Now, for the first time in 20 years, when they offer their long-term, low-interest rate loans, we'll be there to match. Our objective, reduce worldwide subsidy, but while this is being done, create a level playing field for selected projects. We will reduce export controls. The computer industry has already voiced overwhelming support for this initiative and complete amazement that the administration has tackled this tough one. We are going to work off of an annual unified budget for all U.S. government export promotion activities so that over time our resources will be allocated more rationally. For small and medium-sized businesses, we are going to open one-stop shops in major U.S. cities throughout the country, offering all U.S. government export promotion services. Companies will be able to get information that is valuable and timely on foreign markets. The U.S. government will act like a trading company, helping small and medium-sized businesses, and in the process, creating an export mentality throughout the country. Where does Ex-Im Bank fit into all of this? Our mission is to help you create and support American jobs. We do this by financing exports to meet foreign government financing competition or to fill the gap when the private sector is not stepping up with financing. We act primarily in the high-growth, high-potential developing world. Last year, the bank provided $15 billion in financings, a record year, up from the previous high of $12.8 billion a little more than 10 years ago. We're evaluating all of our programs with one objective in mind: becoming more customer service oriented. We have already reduced the time that it takes to respond from 3 months to 2 weeks in a majority of our deals. Our faster response helps customers clinch deals. We are also preparing for the wave of private sector deals that will be coming our way if you go out and push U.S. exports in the growing private sectors in the developing world. 2 years ago, virtually all of our loans were to governments. The shift to the private sector is underway, and we are retooling to be more responsive to project finance and other private sector transactions. We're committed to doing a better job of helping small and medium-sized businesses grow into large exporters. We're improving our pre-export financing program to small business so that banks and other financial intermediaries will increase lending to these exporters. One way, and perhaps the most important way that we improve, is by you and others suggesting ways that we can do better. Recently, a major company suggested an innovative program for riskier markets. The proposal calls for the company to share the risk of non-payment in such markets, a significant deviation from our normal guaranteeing, insuring, and lending. The company benefits by being able to gain a toehold in a potentially large market. We benefit from the company's on-the-ground expertise and their obvious incentive to be repaid, because if we lose, they lose. This is the type of innovation that will push U.S. exports even further and will allow us to become better partners with you. I invite and urge each and every one of you who believes that you have an idea of how we can do things better to contact me. I am very interested in having us be the absolute best we can be in assisting you to export. The Clinton administration understands the new demands placed upon us by change. We have acted to reorder government to maximize our ability to help American business flourish, particularly in overseas markets. The country needs you to seize the opportunities that the developing world offers. We currently, as a country, do not have the necessary business presence in many of the key developing markets. Every time I meet a Japanese business leader, he has just returned from China or some other large, important market. European and Japanese companies are substantially increasing the size of their staffs in the most promising markets. These same companies demand that their employees either be foreign nationals or that they learn the language and customs of these markets. These investments pay long-term dividends. American business should do no less. In 1946, we faced a changed world and we prospered. Today, we face the same challenge. I repeat my prediction of strong economic growth. exports to the developing world are the key. Together, U.S. business and government will realize the promise of the 21st century. Thank you. Be glad to answer questions.
Mr. Brody, that was a very inspiring speech you made this morning. We heard the Secretary and Mickey Cantor. You say that 11% of our GNP are exports. I believe you said that the German one was 33%. If that's a fact, I guarantee you that the German industry does not have the political obstacles that we as businessmen have in the United States. You focus on China. And I mentioned that early this morning. There's no way that you can do a fair amount of business in China with all the political obstacles that we have with the MFN. So Ambassador Cantor tells us that he was frustrated with the trade minister in France. Well, he was frustrated. I'll guarantee you the French are doing lots of business in China and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. You could help us a lot in convincing this administration, who is committed to change, to separate the political from the trade barriers that we face.
Are there any other questions or comments? Frankly, I think what we can say is a number of things. One is the President in his new export strategy has indeed started on the road to major change. Putting back in or a tide aid matching program changes 20 years of prior policy. Stepping up boldly in export controls on computers is a clear major break from the past. Anyone in the computer industry will tell you that not only did they greet that announcement with glee, they also greeted it with amazement. One of the things that people in this room can do to be, I think, effective in having our policies and politics reflect the realities of our economic situation is to participate in a much broader way in the education of the American public at large with respect to the importance of exports. The sad fact is because we have been a country that has prospered so much by relying internally, and it has only been recently that exports have started to become significant to the country's economic health in a visible way. We have a country that is recognition of this lags the reality. Our country is a wonderful democracy and responds to its people. Its people need to be well educated. Focus groups will demonstrate that people, sophisticated people, do not understand exports equals the kinds of jobs that we want to and need to have in this society. So I would say that there is a lot to be done, and there is also a lot that can be done by the people in this room at a very key grassroots level.
With the TPCC, and you're to be congratulated for it. I think that the fact that the administration early in the year was going to bat to create a jobs program that were going to create dead-end jobs, and they were going to put billions into it, that the priorities were in the wrong place. I've got a chart here on a study that we are in the last stages of completing, and it's a comparison of the financial support given to exports by Japan, Germany, France, and England. The U.S. is down here at 2.9%, Germany is at 5.7%, the U.K. is at 11.5%, France is at 23.4%, and Japan is way up here at 51.4%. So I think as a player, we're not even in the ball game. I think that this government has to use the Ex-Im Bank and its resources by increasing its resources to create better paying jobs that are dedicated to the export market.
How many of you equate the spending of money in your businesses with profitable results? And how many of you would prefer to figure out ways to achieve the same result without spending a lot of money? And how many of you, if you have been racked with a large amount of debt on your balance sheet, would conclude that you better be a lot smarter before you start spending your money? It's some of those thoughts that I brought with me to the Clinton administration. And what we are determined to do, and we have been showing that we can do in spades, is to provide all the support that our companies could possibly need, and at the same time not cost the rest of us more money. That sounds like magic. It really isn't. It's hard work. It's looking at the facts. Even when one looks at charts like that, you know, there are a million ways to tell a story with data. And I would imagine for those of you who have been in sales at all in any of your operations, you could probably pick any set of facts and tell a few different stories. The interesting things about the data mentioned was that the real economic powerhouse, well, two of the real economic powerhouses, U.S. and Germany, spend very little. Whereas France, which in many sectors is not one of our strongest competitors, finds itself having to spend a lot more. And Japan obviously spends a lot, but what they do to get most of that spending is to force their companies to take insurance. Most of you large companies do self-insurance and don't have to spend the money at all. I guess what I would say is I agree completely with the thrust of the notion that we need to do more. And we have started, I think, very clearly to do more. And not to do more in small steps, but to do more in very big and bold steps. But what I have also concluded after looking at the facts is we have a very, very long way to go by just using our smarts, our performance, and our ability to work with each other before we have to start dipping into each of your pockets to spend more in this arena. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. I hope you all take the advantage, for those of you who find it appropriate and useful, to contact Ex-Im as well. Alan, do you want to come in? I'm sure you all know our next speaker. Just sit down. I see some nice words about you. I'm sure you all know Alan Greenspan, the chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. What you may not know is that prior to earning a summa cum laude economics degree, he attended the Juilliard School of Music. Given the enormous role that he has played in shaping our nation's economic policy over the last 40 years, I think we can all agree that music's loss was the economy's gain. Dr. Greenspan's distinguished career spans both the public and private sectors. He served as chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors under President Ford and a chair of the National Committee on Social Security Reform under President Reagan. He is currently serving his second term as the 13th chair of the Federal Reserve, and he will sit on the Fed's Board of Governors until the year 2006. In addition, he has been chair and president of Townsend Greenspan, Inc., an economic consulting firm in New York City, and as a director of several major corporations. Through his distinguished service to 4 presidents, Alan Greenspan well deserves his reputation as an old Washington hand with the rare ability to balance political forces with the needs of the financial markets while retaining the respect of both. Please welcome Dr. Alan Greenspan.
I was really getting to enjoy that. I thought that I just might as well sit there and listen. It was getting better as the time went on. There are, however, some people out there who think I play out of tune. There's an extraordinary issue that I think we're all involved with, perhaps at a distance, but we have all been extraordinarily mesmerized by the events that have occurred in the former Soviet Union in recent years, and we're grasping to try to understand them. And it really is an unusual period in world history, and my suspicion is that when we look back at the process from, say, the focus of 1995, 1997, the year 2000, it's going to be an extraordinary period in world history, and I don't think yet we know how it's going to come out by even a close call. This process really starts several years ago. In fact, if one could choose a date, one would choose November the 9th, 1989, because that's the date the Berlin Wall came down, symbolizing the end of an experiment in social policy that began more than 4 decades earlier with the division of the states of Western and Central Europe into market economies and those governed by state central planning. At the end of World War II, as Winston Churchill put it, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain descended across the continent. The economies on the Soviet side of the curtain had been, in the pre-war period, similar to the market-based economies on the Western side. Over 4 decades, both types of economies developed with limited interaction across the dividing line. It was as close to a controlled experiment in economic systems as could ever be implemented. With the books now open on this experiment, we of course have learned much about how communist economics works, or more exactly, does not. But the biggest surprise is what this experiment is teaching us about how our own Western economies and societies function. Or perhaps more exactly, refreshing long dormant memories of the process. Much of what we took for granted in our system and had grown to assume to be human nature was not nature at all, but culture. The dismantling of the central planning function of a communist economy does not automatically establish a free market entrepreneurial system. there is a vast amount of capitalist culture and infrastructure underpinning market economies, which has evolved over generations. Laws, conventions, behaviors, and a wide variety of business professions, accounting, auditing, banking, and marketing. We are gaining significant new insights into how market systems work as the new leaders of the former communist states, with our help, struggle to convert centrally planned economies to ones based on free markets. An understanding of how their systems worked relative to ours is crucial in managing the transition. Economists have had considerable experience in observing how market economies converted to centrally planned ones, but have virtually no exposure in the opposite direction. Ironically, in implementing the latter, we are being forced to understand fully the roots of our own system. At the risk of being somewhat academic, I'd like to take some time to describe why countries with centrally planned economies have not been able to match those with market-based ones in promoting the welfare of their citizens, and hence why the 4-decade experiment in economic systems turned out in favor of capitalism. This explanation will help us to outline the problems that will have to be confronted in a successful transition of communist economies to capitalist ones. The most cogent way to understand why a centrally planned economic system such as that which existed in the Soviet Union has great difficulty in creating wealth and rising standards of living is to examine how the production and distribution of goods and services takes place in such an economy. In theory and to a large extent in practice, production and distribution are determined by specific instructions, often in the form of state orders coming from the central planning agencies to the various different establishments, indicating from whom and in what quantities they should receive their goods and services, and to whom they should distribute their final outputs. The machinery factory is given a quota to produce a certain number of machines to be shipped at a certain time to industries X, Y, and Z. At the same time, it is given authority to procure from the relevant steelworks so many tons of hot-rolled sheet or cold-finished bars, certain electronic components from the electrical works, and so forth. Its employment and wages are predetermined. But although wages are paid in cash, the actual ability to employ cash for purchases is often constrained by the second element frequently found in a centrally planned economy, namely rationing or its equivalent, standing in queues for limited quantities of goods. The consequences, as one might readily anticipate, are huge shortages of products that consumers desire and are not produced in adequate supplies by state orders, or huge surpluses of goods which, while produced, are not wanted by the populace. I do not suspect that shoe stores ended up with an excess of left-handed shoes, but I'm not fully convinced that that is in fact the case. One might think that the planning authorities should be able to adjust to these distortions. They try. But centrally planned economies face fundamental handicaps in making such adjustments. They do not have access to the immediate signals of price changes that so effectively clear markets in capitalist countries. In addition, individual enterprises have no incentive to respond to shortages or oversupply, since their only obligation is to fulfill their part of the so-called plan. While economic planners are generally insulated from the demands of consumers by totalitarian political systems. Finally, to adjust means to move resources, people, equipment, and factories from producing one good to producing another, this profoundly offends the underlying culture of a centrally planned economy, namely stability. The ideal state of affairs for such an economy is one in which there is continuous production of the same type of goods, of the same quality, of the same design, obediently purchased in repetitive quantities with cash wages backed by rationing coupons. One would presume, however, that had no such market-based economies existed side by side with the centrally planned ones, that few changes from the old ways of doing things would have been implemented. That these economies were highly inefficient is best illustrated by the fact that energy consumed per unit of output was as much as 5 to 7 times higher in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union than in the West. Moreover, the exceptionally large amount of resources devoted to capital investment without contributing to the productive capacity of these economies suggests that these resources were largely wasted. In addition, such gaps in efficiency actually understate the gap in performance because they fail to take into account the impact on industrial activity, the impact of industrial activity itself on the environment. The market economies of the West have expended resources to minimize the adverse impact of industrial activity on the environment and thereby lowered their net output. No such resource allocation was made in the Soviet bloc, and the cumulative effect of this neglect is clearly appalling. In sharp contrast to the quasi-permanence of centrally planned economies, capitalist market systems are driven by what Professor Joseph Schumpeter a number of decades ago called creative destruction. By this he meant the continuous obsolescence and abandonment of goods and services, replaced by newer ways of doing things, newer products, and novel engineering and architectural insights. The result has been an economy of continuous retirement of factories and equipment and a reshuffling of workers to new and different activities. Indeed, what is not fully understood about the American economy is the extent to which it churns as new activities and new jobs continuously displace older ones. Indeed, it is nothing short of startling to realize that in the United States, approximately 400,000 workers a week lose their jobs, matched normally by a slightly higher figure of newly created job openings. Such job turnover is facilitated by the extraordinarily large number of new small businesses that come into existence every week and month, offset by a comparable number of establishments that fail, downsize through mergers, or are otherwise abandoned. Market economies, in that sense, are continuously renewing themselves. Innovation, risk-taking, and competition are the driving forces that propel standards of living progressively higher. What drives this innovative process, as I indicated earlier, is a whole infrastructure of market institutions. Until the Berlin Wall was breached and the need to develop market economies out of the rubble of central planning became apparent, little thought had been given to this critical institutional infrastructure by the economics profession. It is certainly apparent from the recent experience in Russia and elsewhere in Eastern Europe that the mere elimination of central planning does not in itself automatically create a market economy. Nonetheless, you do get something akin to it in that black markets replicate much of what seemingly goes on in a market economy. But there are really quite fundamental differences. Black markets, by definition, are not supported by the rule of law. There are no property rights in such a market, that is, in a formal sense, the right to own and dispose of property protected by the enforcement power of the state. There is no law of contracts or bankruptcy or judicial review and determination, again enforced by the state, the essential ingredients of a market economy. A formal legal structure which defines and protects property rights and trade through the laws of contract and bankruptcy must pre-exist before a viable, sophisticated market economy can emerge from the remnants of a centrally planned one. Even now, many potential investors in these newly emerging economies fear that a signed contract which has the force of law and is backed by the police powers in the West, is nothing more than an autograph in some economies of the East. In addition to a legal structure, a functioning market economy also requires a number of business professions that have no purpose and hence no existence in a centrally planned system. I speak of accountants, auditors, and marketing specialists, all those professions whose activities are an integral part of the mechanism of production and distribution in a market economy, functions which are accomplished by state orders, rationing, and queuing in a centrally planned economy. The effects of accounting, for example, or lack thereof in the old Soviet Union is really quite instructive. A machine or a facility in the old Soviet Union was generally continued in operation until it literally broke down. Thus, it is not very much of a surprise to see on collective farms tractors that look as though they hark back to the 1920s. What accounting in a market economy does, if perhaps in a somewhat crude form, is to estimate economic depreciation of an existing facility such that when the net book value of a facility approaches zero, its capability of adding value to the production process also approaches zero. This is a signal that such equipment should be replaced with a newer version. What constitutes the state of economic depreciation itself is, of course, continually changing. Obsolescence is a relative term. But no matter what principle of accounting is applied in a market economy, one rarely, if ever, finds 50-year-old facilities still functioning. But such facilities were widespread in the old Soviet Union. The sophisticated auditing procedures that have evolved over the years fine-tune our accounting procedures to improve the basis of decision-making that in a market economy replaces central planning. The profession of marketing endeavors to ascertain the multitude of choices that consumers and business make on a day-by-day basis, and which, as a consequence, contribute to a system of price signals that drive production and distribution in a market economy. In a centrally planned economy, this function is crudely accomplished, if at all, by the political hierarchy who substitute their judgments of what goods are valuable for those of their fellow citizens. It is thus no accident that in defense and military activities, the shortfall in the performance of centrally planned economies was far less than in civilian activities relative to their counterparts in market systems. Finally, the most important difference between market and centrally planned systems is the role played by banking and finance. In a centrally planned system, banking and finance play a decidedly minor role. Since the production and distribution of goods and services is essentially driven by state orders and rationing, finance is little more than record keeping. While there are pro forma payment transfers among state-owned enterprises, few, if any, actions are fundamentally driven by them. Payment arrears or even defaults are largely irrelevant in the sense that they are essentially transactions among enterprises owned by the same entity, that is, the state. There are no credit standards, no interest rate risk, no market value changes, that is, none of the key financial signals that determines who gets credit and who does not, and hence who produces what and sells to whom in a market economy. As a consequence, the central planning systems of the old Soviet Union and their Eastern European satellites usually consisted of a single bank and a savings bank system, the main purpose of which was to hold the savings deposits of the populace. There were, of necessity, more sophisticated institutions to finance international trade and payments. Nonetheless, the domestic financial structures were primitive. Indeed, non-cash monetary instruments, important means of payment in most market economies, barely existed. Clearance of payments, which in market economies are either instantaneous or at most take several days, take weeks or months. The basic reason, of course, is that it didn't matter. Few decisions in the centrally planned economies were affected by the lack of a developed financial system. The evident primitiveness of the financial system and its irrelevancy in a centrally planned economy creates a truly important insight in how crucial in the production and distribution of goods and services are the sophisticated financial institutions and instruments in the West. To repeat, the presumption that if you eliminate the infrastructure of a central planning system and free prices, wages, capital movements, and so forth, that a free market will automatically develop overnight is surely dubious. Scrapping the central planning system is obviously a necessary condition of the evolving of a market system. But unless there are rudimentary institutions that can be rapidly converted to an effective market-based structures that can facilitate production and distribution, the transition will be significantly stretched out. Even more deep-seated than the specific market institutions, the laws of contracts, bankruptcy law, property rights, the disciplines of accounting, auditing, and marketing are the attitudes of people. In the most profound sense, the culture. How do people deal with one another? What is the implicit premise of the exchange of goods and services in various different types of economic systems? How do education and ideology interrelate? We have learned more about these inculcated differences as the old centrally planned economies break down, and accordingly, how much of our culture is developed and not solely the consequences of human nature. In a market economy, youngsters learn the workings of free trade and exchange very early. What are the appropriate attitudes amongst individuals in, for example, an exchange of money for goods at the grocer or the drugstore? Presumptively, there is a status of equality that exists between the purveyor of goods and the purchaser in a market economy. There is, in most instances, due respect mutually accorded. The customers rely on their suppliers. Sellers' livelihoods rest on their customers. In a centrally planned economy, by distinction, the job of the purveyor of goods does not depend on the sanction of the consumer. And indeed, for those of us who have been exposed to waiters and clerks in restaurants and retail establishments in the old Soviet Union, this behavior pattern is strikingly obvious. The differing attitudes and views are carried from generation to generation through family value and education systems. Hence, the process of full transition will of necessity be slow. It will be especially difficult for economic reasons as well. Creative destruction in an advanced market is gradual. There are rarely huge discontinuities, but the centrally planned economies are frozen in time. They reflect an earlier age. I suspect that the output of Czechoslovakia in, say, 1988 could have been competitive in the Western markets of, say, 1958, but not later. But rebuilding a modern competitive market economy from a 1958 base is a disruptive, expensive, and time-consuming task. Another difficult aspect of adjustment in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union will be in overcoming distortions in the location of economic activity. Marxist ideology has always presumed competition to be destructive, and hence the centrally planned economies of the Soviet bloc organized their production through state monopolies. Moreover, Soviet planners tended to overestimate economies of scale. As a result, the production of most products was highly concentrated geographically, often in huge one-industry towns. Soviet planners also tried to promote economic development in the many non-Russian regions in order to offset centrifugal forces ever present in Moscow's multi-ethnic empire. Whole industries were distributed across the Soviet bloc with little regard to transportation costs or the other factors that determine industrial location in market economies. Because of these policies, the regional economies of the former Soviet bloc are interdependent to an abnormal degree. This in turn has meant that the disruptions to inter-regional trade that have inevitably accompanied the breakup of the Soviet economic system have been very costly. Given the difficulties of the transition, one almost would like to move the populations of these countries to a vacation hotel for a few years while the old system is torn down and rebuilt from scratch. Reformers, of course, have no such luxury. The adjustments, as we can readily observe, are slow and socially wrenching, but there is no alternative. Fortunately, the peoples of the former Soviet Union and those of Central Europe appear to understand this. The percent who would truly like to resurrect the old regime is clearly small. Up to this point, I have spoken exclusively about the economic benefits of a market system, but there is an important link between economic and political systems. It is no accident that real democracy developed in the part of Europe that had a market-oriented economic system. In fact, this is merely one example of a general rule. The fact that virtually all real democracies have liberal capitalist economic systems suggests that such an economic system may well be a necessary, though clearly not a sufficient condition for the development of democracy. When too much economic power is concentrated in the hands of the government, the governor's self-interest tend to dominate the interests of its citizens. We should remember the most important task of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union today is not economic reconstruction. It is the establishment of democratic political systems that respect and protect individual rights. Market-oriented economic systems should be promoted as much because they are the economic system that is most compatible with democracy as because of its unquestioned economic superiority. If successful, the changes taking place in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union today will benefit the West in many ways. The full integration of the peoples and natural resources of the former Soviet bloc into the global market-based trading system creates opportunities for investment and global economic growth that are truly awesome. Most importantly, the spread of liberal democracy to this region will, in the long run, make our world safer. Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union's transition to democratic market economies will doubtless be both difficult and slow, but the rewards are patently worth waiting for. Thank you very much.
Chairman Greenspan is willing to take some questions, and I will field them. Let me remind you to please identify yourself. Yes. You'd ask them to move to a microphone.
Questions around here. Dr. Greenspan, about 2 years ago, you had just come back from the Kremlin, and you made some interesting comments at a similar session as we are seeing here today. Your comment was that you indeed recognized a change when the hat check girl wore a "I Love New York" button in the Kremlin that took your coat. You also coined an expression at the time that there were billions of rubles under the mattresses of the Russian people. What has happened to those billions of rubles, and how and when are they going to be convertible for the free market exchange of buying products?
My recollection at the time was the ruble exchange rate was a very small fraction of where it is today, and that most of the value implicit in those rubles under the mattress have evaporated as a consequence of the inflation that's taken hold, and as a consequence of that, the extraordinary instabilities that have occurred. So I'm not sure how one can look at this stage at any meaningful balance sheet in rubles in either the business community or the household sector in any readily understandable way, or understandable for those in the West. But what is fascinating about the whole financial system is that there's a learning process that is going on at a very rapid rate. What is really quite disturbing, I guess, is that the base from which this acceleration of learning starts is very marginal and very primitive. In that case, you're going to choose it, Joan.
Sorry, yes.
What impact do you see that NAFTA will have on monetary policy?
You mean in the United States? The real question is, what does NAFTA do to not only the economies of Mexico, but Latin America generally? And the presumption that I could readily come to is that largely as a consequence of the lessons that everyone has been learning about the choices between capitalism and state-controlled economies, the Latin American economies, Mexico being obviously the most immediate one in our regard, have moved remarkably away from collectivist-type central planning, which so characterized much of what went on in the economic planning processes in most of those countries. They now have decided, generally, that free market, capitalist, entrepreneurial systems work. That's where growth comes from, and that's essentially what they are seeking to move towards, which means they're moving towards the United States. And that means basically that if NAFTA fails, there is a very wrenching event here which would have political, international economic, as well as domestic economic effects. I would hesitate to talk in terms of monetary policy, because monetary policy in this country responds to the economy with which we're dealing. The crucial question is, how will NAFTA affect basically the broad relationships that exist between the United States and Latin America, and what will it do here? I think what we have learned over the past decades, since the end of World War II especially, is that dynamic economies, those that trade, those that have open borders to trade, are those that grow the fastest and those where the standards of living rise the most. One can scarcely argue that Mexico per se has a major impact on the United States, but it is clearly positive if they are growing and if their trade is expanding and if they are a more open economy, which is what NAFTA is trying to do. But I think the crucial question is that we go beyond Mexico, because how this whole argument, if I may put it that way, turns out is clearly going to affect far more about American economic and political relationships